Hello, beloved baddies. In this episode of Called to Be Bad, I talk with Sarah Renee Werner, who is an editor, writer, and pastor living in Columbus, Ohio. You can find Sarah's full bio in the description. Sarah is the author of the book Rooted Faith: Practices of Living Well on a Fragile Planet. In this episode, we discuss Sarah's book, and in particular, the idea of animism and how it relates to Christian faith. No worries, if you don't know what that means, we will get into it. We also talk about how all of creation is alive, including rocks, and how connecting and respecting everything wild around us is both biblical and beneficial to our daily lives. There is a lot of talk of squirrels, birds, and of course chickens, knowing me. There is a special mention of divine pigeons, so make sure you watch out for that. Oh, and I wanted to say, for some reason, my mic was turned up way too loud on this episode, so that is why my audio sounds a little bit funny. I tried to fix it and turn it down, but yeah, I did the best I could. I want to say a special thank you for staying connected to this podcast. It means a lot. And your bad homework for this week is to try and listen to this episode while you are outside. I mean, do your best. You don't have to, but if you want to, listen to it outside and see what happens. Okay, bye!
First, I'll ask permission to enter a forest or to touch a tree, and that's something I learned from an indigenous person. But once you ask a tree if you can touch a leaf and listen, you can hear some kind of response.
Okay. 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Welcome to Call to Be Bad.
Thanks.
We envision this at Goshen Brewing Company. Do you remember this? We were there after Central District Conference meeting, and I was like, Sarah, what's your bad topic? And you're like, well, actually, I'm writing a book about it. And I was like, great. Yeah, and so today we are going to talk about animism, and I haven't figured out what I want to title this episode yet. I have different ideas, unless you for marketing purposes want it titled Rooted Faith. But one of my ideas was Dirty Faith because it's earthy soil. Anyways. I totally lost my train of thought. Yeah, we're going to talk about animism, and if that is a new concept to people, never fear, we will define it, get into it, and why it's a heresy or against. Isn't animism considered a heresy?
I mean, by who? Sort of.
Okay.
Historically.
Okay.
Not by me.
We'll get into it. Not by Sarah. Yeah. And I think my other title, I was a little bit out of my mind reading your book last night because I was like, it's too late. I can't get into it. I'll just skim through. And then I started, and then I was 3/4 of the way through, and I was like, I need to go to bed. But so I ended up skimming the last bit. But I'm amazed that I think that is says something about how you wrote the book that I was not. Anyways, what are you drinking today, Sarah?
I'm drinking in my giant cup. It's Tiesta Tea Fireside Spice, and it's kind of Tiesta Tea makes herbal teas that are loose leaf. I really like that. I don't like the powder of the tea bags, and it's a little bit of a Christmas tea. I think I got it after Christmas last year, but it's very cinnamony and seems very appropriate for fall. I'm one of those people that enjoys pumpkin spice flavored things, so it's sort of like that, but a little bit different.
pumpkin spice adjacent tea.
Yes.
That's great. And you have it in, can you show us your big old mug?
Yeah. Makes a lot. 24 ounces.
24 ounces.
Yeah.
Very nice.
It keeps it hot for a long time.
I love that. So I have coffee, of course. No surprises here. But I can't remember if I had this mug in the podcast before, but it's actually a teacup, and I'm really trying not to spill my coffee. It's very full, if you can see. And it has like this really, I think it's a really pretty floral design. And I have dishes to match. And it's actually from my mom worked with someone named Jenny, who is from Australia, and they had a breastfeeding business together. And by breastfeeding business, I mean they helped people who were breastfeeding and helped with like nursing bras and pumps, etc. It was called Breastfeeding Essentials. Anyways, so Jenny in Australia, tea time, or maybe just for her, I don't know, was very important. And so she had all these tea sets. And so this is from Jenny. And I think her son watches the podcast, so that's why little shout out there.
Nice.
Anyway, so I picked the floral design because of talking about, the environment and earth and flowers and yeah. So we'll be talking in general about your book, but more specifically, we'll be talking about animism. So how do you define this word? It doesn't have to be the perfect dictionary definition. And why do you think it is a bad topic? Like, why talk about this on Called to Be Bad?
So I think animism has a couple different definitions. My favorite one is from anthropologist Graham Harvey, who has written a lot about animism in his life. And his idea is basically animism is the awareness that the world is full of persons, and only some of those persons are human, and that our lives are lived in relationship with others. And so I think centering it on relationship is very important. And kind of when you think about it this way, it's really easy to see we are in relationship with others all the time. I breathe in oxygen that trees have breathed out, just very simple kinds of things. So animism used to be a bad word because it was used to describe indigenous religion as being uncivilized. It was used in contrast to the so-called monotheistic religions, especially in early religious scholarship in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Part of the colonial project was proving that you're better than the people that you're colonizing. And so calling people animist was a way to kind of denigrate their religious tradition. And I think now it's a controversial topic because when you start talking about animals and trees and rocks having souls, people assume that means, oh, you're worshiping nature, like you're a pantheist or you're a pagan. But it's important to remember that animism and monotheism aren't antithetical. Animism is just a recognition of relationship and of the personhood of other beings. It's not making divine beings of everything that you see. There are indigenous traditions that do revere certain trees and rocks and things like that as being sacred, but animism at its heart doesn't necessarily mean that. And so I think that it's gotten kind of a bad rap lately. And I think it's also important to know that animism was the prevailing worldview of the Hebrew Bible. So the people that were writing the Bible and even into Jesus' time, even though they were practicing monotheism and Judaism, they also understood that the world was alive in a way that we really miss. And if you want to know more about that, Mark Wallace has an excellent book that's called When God Was a Bird, and he kind of goes into depth about it.
Yeah, and you give several examples in your book about that kind of animism worldview popping up. And I can't remember if you mentioned this in your book, but Katerina Hea, she wrote this amazing sermon when we were in seminary together. She was, I had her on for Wild Church, and she talked about the rocks that split open and like grieved Jesus's death. You talk about the rocks, and she connected it to the stone that was rolled away. And I don't know, there was just like this really kind of brilliant, like the stones crying out and that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I don't talk about that, but that's an excellent example from the New Testament of the earth being alive and grieving.
Yeah. And it reminds me of one of my favorite songs growing up that we would sing in church. You shall go out with joy, and it talks about the trees of the field clapping their hands, and I always like pictured that in my brain, like the trees clapping their hands, and like I'm sitting here and like looking out onto these like beautiful maple trees and that are like swaying in the wind, and I'm like, they're clapping.
Yeah. And that wasn't just a cute metaphor. That was like reality. They're actually clapping. That's from Isaiah 53, and that's a really good example of like this kind of praising. All creation praises God.
So when is that true of, because we talk a lot about like biblical metaphor, and so would you be saying that it was more literal than like we make it a little bit more metaphorical because of our own worldview?
Yeah, that makes us more comfortable to think about it as a metaphor. Because if rocks are alive and praising God, you can't build a strip mine right there because you're destroying something holy. So it can't be holy if you're going to use it as a resource in a denigrating way.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I understand like the concept of trees being alive, as in we see them like move and change and go through that kind of life cycle. How are rocks alive?
Well, that's an excellent question. Everything that exists has energy about it. And so there's David Abram is an environmental philosopher, and one of the books he wrote was Becoming Animal. And in that book, he describes a like hypothetical situation with involving the reader, and he asks you to imagine that you're walking down a forest path and the trees are on both sides of you, and all of a sudden you go around a bend and you see a sheer rock face in front of you, and the sun is shining on it, and you literally step back or kneel because it just takes your breath away. And he said that is the energy, the essence of the rock affecting your body, and it literally moves us. And we don't think about, like, we think of rocks as just existing, but the rock is a being that is using its rock energy, and it's not the same energy as plants or humans. It's a much more subtle thing. And from a purely scientific point of view, rocks breathe. Rocks get bigger when they're warm and they get smaller, they contract in the cold. And that's why when they build bridges, they put like rubber lines on either side, because a bridge will expand and contract as it gets colder or warmer. So everything is moving, and a tree can break down a rock over thousands of years and turn it into sand. So rock is always becoming something else. But we don't think of that often because in our very short time span, we just see a rock as something that's unmoving. But everything's always moving.
Well, and one of the things you talk about in your book is how, and not just from an environmental standpoint, but how, there's like these like individual components, but then everything is also connected. So like, when we're talking about a rock, I picture like this little rock that my friend Elizabeth gave me. But if you think about it, like, I don't know, like rocks make up mountains. Like it's like they're part of the earth, they're part of the ground, and so if the earth is alive, then rocks are alive. And I heard someone talk about they were like trying to clear a field, and they go around and they pick out all the rocks, and then a week later they go and there's more rocks. And he's like, where are all these rocks coming from? And they're like being I don't know. I assume they're being like pushed up out of the ground or something, but yeah, that's really interesting. So yeah, before we go more into how everything is alive and a person and etc., I want to know how your love of creation kind of formed, how this became a topic of interest for you, and how your book Rooted Faith was kind of born, like how it came together for you.
I feel like I've sort of always been an environmentalist. I grew up in the city in Dallas, Texas, but my parents always loved camping, and so we went camping a lot of weekends. And so we spent a lot of time in more rural, wild nature, hiking and camping. And I made moccasins when I was in high school because I wanted to feel the earth beneath my feet, like weird stuff like that normal teenagers don't do. And when I got to the point that I was thinking about writing a book, I had been reading a lot of new texts in eco-theology. And there's all this great stuff that's come out just in the last few years by indigenous scholars, people of color, scholars from the global south that are kind of redefining eco-theology in a good way, because up until now, eco-theology has been very white Protestant, characterized by the Western worldview. And so it was worldview changing stuff for me. But as I was reading it, I was thinking no one in my congregation would be able to get through this text because it's so full of jargon and so dense and inaccessible for a general audience. And the second thing I noticed was that all of the stuff about eco-theology is great ideas, but there wasn't anything practical. It wasn't like, here's a great idea, now here's what you could do. And so I wanted to offer practical resources for actually reconnecting and actually thinking about your faith in the context of wherever you're located. And so that was the idea, to write a book that people in my congregation would understand and want to read, and that was also full of actual resources instead of just great ideas.
That was part of why I had a hard time stopping reading your book last night, is because like there'd be like links to go, and I was like all of a sudden like very curious what kind of soil and rocks are under me in Goshen, Indiana, and like the geological maps, and then my watershed. I was like, oh, now I need to know about my watershed. So I was like looking up all these things, and I was like, Nick, come look at our watershed.
That's great.
So it's definitely practical and accessible and full of stories, and I don't know if you can see, but like underlining and starring, and I love interacting with books, and this is definitely one to interact with. At one point you talk about Merlin. Can you tell us about Merlin? Isn't it Merlin?
Yeah, so Merlin is a species of raptor. They're small, kind of like falcons. And so they generally migrate through Ohio to other places. They don't stay here. But this Merlin has decided to make our neighborhood her home for whatever reason, and she's here in all the seasons of the year. And so I started calling her Merlin like as a proper name. And whenever I walk the dog twice a day, and often I see her every day, either sitting on a power line or sitting in a tree. Sometimes I'll be sitting in the backyard and she'll swoop down and eat a chipmunk or a mouse or something like that. And I just stand in the road watching her sometimes, and she watches me back. She never flies away. And so I feel like we have, I don't know what she thinks of the strange human that's standing in the street watching her. But I feel like we have something of a relationship. And I don't think I would have ever noticed that this bird was behaving differently if I hadn't spent so much time outside. And so she's been here for 3 or 4 years now. I'm not sure what the lifespan of Merlin's is, but something in our neighborhood has, piqued her interest and she decided not to fly away. And so it
Mm-hmm.
feels really special to have a relationship with a wild animal that is so different than myself.
Yeah. And you say at one point that that being seen by her, it kind of I don't know, it did I forget your exact words, but it like did something. It made you feel like seen and recognizing that like we think of ourselves often as like the center of our world. And and to kind of recognize that they're like just thinking about I'm not saying it right, but just like how you felt less lonely because this little bird, this little raptor was watching you, was engaging with you. Yeah, I just thought that was really neat, especially because on the podcast I say um like the goal is to feel less lonely for just being human. And so it kind of touched me, this like idea of like you can go outside, and even if you are physically alone, as in you are the only human being there, you're still not alone. You're surrounded by life.
Yeah. All you have to do is step outside. You're part of a
Mm-hmm.
community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought that was really neat. I've been walking my co-pastor and friend's dog Lucy, and and I feel bad because my spouse Nick has always been like, let's go for walks, and sometimes I'm like I'm in my one mode and not wanting to go for walks, and now I'm like so happy to go for walks with Lucy. And but it's gotten me outside and paying attention in ways that I haven't in a while, and it's been really precious time. And um I was part of a retreat weekend, and they asked what our spiritual practices were, and I wrote down walking with Lucy because of that experience of being outside and um connecting with creation. So I get it.
Yeah. Dogs are an excellent reason to go outside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I spend like when I can, when I don't have meetings, I try to work outside in my backyard as much as possible so I can let my chickens out. And I thought of you when you're talking about Merlin looking at you, because sometimes my chickens like to be cuddled. Surprisingly enough, they're actually more cuddly than my bunnies.
Yeah.
And so I'll be holding my one of my chickens, and she'll kind of like look at me, and I'll like look at her, and I'm like, I can't tell if we're bonding or you're gonna like try and peck my eye right now. But
You just have to keep
yeah.
listening and you might find an answer.
Well, I feel very in tune with my chickens and with like my backyard, and like even with like the birds will make a certain noise and the chickens will all go run and hide. So like the birds, which are not chickens, are communicating with the chickens, and the same thing with the squirrels. The squirrels will make a certain noise, and I'll be like, oh, there's a cat. And I'll go and be like, sure enough, there's a cat. The squirrels told me that there was a cat.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like yeah, I am right here with you with like everything is alive. And a person, like and that we're constantly like interacting with each other. So what would you say to someone that was like, I don't know, and maybe that's not your audience, but I'm just curious, like, speaking of in the
I
environment interacting with me, I am like in the sun right now.
I think if it's too much to think about wild nature interacting with you, all you have to do is spend time with a dog or a cat.
Mm,
They're obviously very emotional beings, and like I think only someone who's never seen a dog could think that they don't have feelings. They
mm,
obviously have feelings. They're excited to see you. They want to play with you. They want to cuddle. They have people that they like more than other people. They
mm-hmm,
remember you. They know when you put on certain clothes that you're going to do certain things. Like work clothes means, oh, they're going to leave. Sweatpants means, oh, we're going to go for a walk and I'm excited, kind of thing. So if you want to just start small, that's a good place to start. I think lots of people have relationships with animals. We just forget that that's, you know, that's an exciting thing to have a relationship with an animal. even if it's sharing your bed with you.
Yeah. And I wonder if we make the distinction between pets or mammals maybe and wild creatures, or like, yeah, we have that relationship, but it's because we like domesticated them over, how many thousands of years. But I mean, yeah, rabbits, the bunnies that I have are domesticated. But they're not like, like some people would be like, oh, well, dogs are smarter than rabbits. I've accidentally taught my rabbits to be excited for when I leave the house because they know that they get a treat before I leave. And so
That's
I'll be
cute.
like putting on my coat and they know like the sound of the zipper and they'll start like running around in circles because they get a treat.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, man. Don't
Yeah,
hold
I
back
mean,
your enthusiasm. Sorry,
yeah, and intelligence-wise, pigs are actually highly intelligent. You can train a pig to do anything that you can train a dog to. They're very smart. They feel empathy for other pigs, that kind of thing. Like, it's easy to, and I mean, that's an example of a domestic animal, but we don't usually share our houses with pigs. But that doesn't make them less smart.
Yeah. Yeah. I have this great video of what seems like a squirrel playing with one of my chickens. Like, it really seems like it is pure play. And sure, maybe it's like imitating, I don't know, some squirrel behavior. But it was up on this fence. I'll have to send it to you. And the chickens, they scare away the squirrels. They'll like run after them and be like, stay away, because they're territorial. And so the squirrel was up on the fence, and the chicken would come over and like look at it, and then the chicken would turn around, and the squirrel would come down and like sneak up behind it, and then the chicken would turn around and it would run back up to the fence and come down, and then it would like get down in the grass and like lower its tail over its back to like sneak attack, and then it like just like hopped around and like did like little backflips, like it's playing, and I'm like,
Yeah,
it was so neat.
that's cool.
So I want to talk a little bit about how this concept of animism interacts with your spirituality, or how it could interact with other spirituality and your Christian faith in particular.
I think that, so first of all, I spend a lot of time sitting in my backyard watching the trees and the birds and all the animals, and that's kind of how I've noticed so many things. And after you spend a certain amount of time in the same landscape, it kind of starts to come alive and you start to see how everything is connected. So we're learning that, trees are connected both underground and through the air. They send messages to each other constantly. And when I'm sitting in the backyard, it just seems like I don't know, I feel connection in a different way now that I've been in the same place for almost 8 years. I have a longer history, and um, it's an entirely different. It sort of becomes an entirely different way of seeing the world. So when I go to a new landscape, first I'll ask permission to enter a forest or to touch a tree, and that's something I learned from an indigenous person. When you don't think of nature as being alive, you forget that you might want to ask permission before you touch something. And it's crazy, like that seems weird because we in Western culture are not primed to think of other beings as needing respect. But once you ask a tree if you can touch a leaf and listen, you can hear some kind of response. And some people might say, oh, it's just in your head, it's an intellectual thing. But I think that, there is energy that we connect with. And so when I ask a tree if I can touch the bark and then I feel it, it feels different. And when I walk through a forest after I've asked permission to be there, it feels different than if I was just doing it like I own the place and I belong everywhere. And that's a very Western way of approaching the world. But lots of Randy Woodley talks about this a little bit in his book, that whenever he goes to speak somewhere, he gets permission from the indigenous community that once lived there or still lives there. And then he feels like he has permission to be there. And so it's kind of similar when you go out into a wild area. We're taught to view the world objectively, which is like a huge myth. There is nothing objective about my presence in the world. Even my being there changed how birds react and squirrels react, and you can't be an objective observer. Like, that's not a thing. Even in particle physics, they've learned that when a particle is observed, it will behave differently than if it is unobserved. And we don't know why that is, but even on the most elemental level, you can't be objective. And so asking permission and showing respect to other creatures is just one step beyond, stepping out of this objectivity and recognizing that we're all subjects. And so I think that when it comes to my relationship with God, I used to have these really holy encounters with animals, especially like birds with the great blue heron, and seeing red-tailed hawks. I think I talk about this in the book, that I saw a hawk when I was 15. It watched me as I was walking up a whole hill and I didn't see it. And those have always felt like really sacred moments to me, but it wasn't until recently that I realized there's language in my religious tradition for talking about that. And so I think that my faith has really deepened since I've read the Bible with new eyes and realized that other people also have these sacred experiences. That faith, when I was growing up, faith was something that was in your mind or something that you felt as an emotion, and something that was in your ethereal spirit that wasn't connected to your body. But that's another dichotomy that we don't really need.
Yeah, can you say more about dualism and how that played a role in how we think of spirituality, and how, these are my words, not yours, but maybe how animism is can be like an antidote to dualistic thinking?
Yeah, so dualism is a really pervasive idea in our culture, and some of it is in the Bible that kind of began with Plato. So Plato had a system where everything that occurred in nature had an ideal form that was part of the spiritual realm. And so, like, every tree is an imperfect reflection of some ideal tree, and every human is an imperfect reflection of some ideal human. And he also talked about the two horses of the body and the soul. And the soul's always trying to get up to heaven, and the body's dragging it down. And that, so we have that in the New Testament. And then we also have Descartes' idea, I think, therefore I am. And so that kind of greatly intensified this idea of dualism. And when you say, I think, therefore I am, that means first that only rational beings, i.e., humans without cognitive disabilities, and in his time it would have been only men, probably white European men, count in this scenario. Everything else is an animal, including women, including people with disabilities, including indigenous people. And there's lots of problems with this. Most importantly, like, rationalism is only one way of thinking and being in the world, and it's very limiting because it rests on this myth of objectivity. And brain research has actually shown that we make decisions emotionally, and then we use logical argument to bolster our emotional opinion. And when you don't have emotions, if that part of your brain has been damaged, you actually make very poor decisions, and you can't have a relationship with anyone because you don't understand how they feel, and you do really devastating things and end up, dead or broke or whatever. And so it leaves out groups of people who are valuable and intelligent in different ways, like children, people with cognitive disabilities. And it also fails to recognize that animals are highly intelligent, which we have a lot of scientific evidence showing that to us now. Even whales and dolphins have a high level of emotional intelligence. And I think that so recently we say that we're past dualism now, but it's just put on different clothes. And so the most recent incarnation of dualism is the separation between the brain and the body, and this idea that our brains control the rest of our bodies, and our bodies are just kind of mindless flesh that we're just walking around. It's a container for our brain to do stuff and touch things. And that's so, that's also not borne out by the scientific evidence. It's just dualism in a different way. For one, we have more nerve cells in our gut than we do in our brain. And
Mm.
that's why when you have some kind of intuitive feeling, you feel it in your stomach because you have a whole second brain that's part of your digestive system. And they're learning about all the ways that your gut microbiome affects things like cognitive decline and, all of that stuff. Another example is people who are completely blind, have no sight, they don't have any sensory input coming from their brain, can still sense their surroundings using the rest of their bodies. And so obviously it's not your brain that's doing that. Your whole body has sense organs. People with spinal cord injuries can perceive touch even if they don't have any input going to their brain from their spinal cord. And so there's so much we don't know about the intelligence of your whole body. And the idea that your mind only resides in your brain is kind of the latest dualism. Our mind is our whole existence and our whole bodies.
Mm.
Um, and I think dualism really separates us from ourselves and from other people and from the natural world. And so animism is just a different worldview that can heal all of these divisions because at its fundamental level, life is about relationship. And you can't like personal autonomy is such a farce. You
Mm.
can't breathe without trees breathing out oxygen. You can't eat without someone probably growing and picking your food unless you're gardening. You can't you can't eat without those plants. You can't exist without a whole like thousands of other people who do things for you. Um, there's no there is no separation. And so I hear that a lot with like people with disabilities are a drag on society because they're not autonomous. No one is autonomous. You were raised by somebody. It may not have been your mother, but it was some other adult. And we rely on other people for all of our needs. It just seems more invisible when you're
Mm.
uh, a non disabled person with a job. So,
Yeah.
those are my thoughts on dualism.
Yeah. No, yeah. I think you're putting words to something that I've not been able to articulate before. Something changed when I read Barbara Brown Taylor's book, An Altar in the World. Have you read
Hmm.
that book?
Yeah, that's a good one.
That's it's when she started she talked about spiritual practices as being woven into your everyday life. So like doing the dishes can be a spiritual practice if you kind of add this element of mindfulness and recognize that all of the ordinary parts of our life are also holy, or we can become aware to how God is in, and yeah, in everything.
Yeah.
And that shifted because I think that spiritual disciplines were so kind of where I viewed them as so compartmentalized. Like you wake up and you have 15 minutes of your like devotions or whatever, and then you go about your day and God just stays in that little devotional time. And
Yeah.
that was just so unattractive and not helpful to me. And plus it was like it made it seem like it was a task to check off the to-do list. And if you didn't do it, then you're a bad Christian. But what I hear you saying and what Barbara Brown Taylor was saying is that God is everywhere. Or it's an invitation, like God is everywhere. Can we open up our eyes to see the divine vibrancy in all the things, in a bee sitting on a flower, like and that
Yeah.
is so much more attractive to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that like I meditate every day and I've been doing that for a long time. And what I've noticed is that when your brain gets used to meditating, you become more awake in the rest of your life. So, like you use the example
Mm.
of doing dishes, that could be a form of meditation, unless you're busy thinking about all the other things you have to do or rehashing an argument with somebody that you already had. Like, we spend so little time in the present moment, but everything that you do, if you're paying attention, that can be a devotion and an act of holiness. And it's kind of a reminder, like right now, it's really easy to see the beauty in creation because the fall colors, at least if you live in kind of northern North America, are going crazy. It's beautiful outside.
Mm.
The crickets are humming. You don't have to go to Jerusalem or the Grand Canyon or something to be on sacred ground. Everything is sacred. And there are times of the year when that seems less evident. But I think, and also every encounter that you have with somebody else, everyone has the light of God in them. Even if you find them irritating or annoying or they're saying something stupid, like we all have the light of God within us, even if it seems buried. And so that's another practice of like, this whole story of the Samaritan stopping to help somebody when the priest was too busy to try to get to church on time. We do that all the time, like failing to see the humanity of people.
Yeah. And you talk about in your book about how Jesus had a walking ministry. And if you slow down and you walk, places, you're so much more aware of these moments of connection or potential connection. Um, what would you say to folks who are like, yes, I want to connect with creation and I live in the middle of the city, or I work all day, or I work night shift and I sleep during the day, I'm in fluorescent lighting. How do I connect with the earth?
So I think that, nature is everywhere, even inside. Like I am sitting in a room that has a wood floor, and that's part of nature. And, um, the walls are sheetrock, but that came from somewhere else on the earth. And so it's important to remember, even if you're inside, you're still part of nature. It can seem more disconnected. And all you have to do is walk outside, even if you're in an urban area. I like to tell this story. So, this is from Mark Wallace's When God Was a Bird. In the original Greek of the Luke account of Jesus' baptism, when the Holy Spirit comes down and takes the form of a dove, which is the literal words, it's not dove, it's like a Palestinian pigeon. And pigeons are literally in every urban ecosystem on the earth. Like you cannot walk down a street and not see a pigeon. And that is how the Holy Spirit chose to be portrayed in the Gospels, was in the form of a pigeon. So you don't have to be in the wilderness to be present with the Holy Spirit. And I would say, just to be aware and pay attention as much as you can is the first step.
Mm. I was so I don't know. Uh, I have this sticky note here, and it says God. You can't read it probably, but it says God coming as pigeon. Because
Nice.
that was my favorite part of your book, was learning that.
Yeah.
I did not know that, and I love that so much. Because again, part of or a different part of this podcast is kind of redefining or looking at the intersections between the holy and ordinary. And what is more ordinary than a pigeon? And it's kind of like this like God coming as a vulnerable little baby, this is another incarnate, God incarnate, and God came as a pigeon. Like, oh, I'm gonna write a sermon about that.
Yeah.
And also, like, I think that pigeons are so neat, because well, I mean, it's actually a little bit sad, but like pigeons are domesticated. Humans domesticated pigeons, and then we just released them. So pigeons, like in their body, they're supposed to be interacting with humans, but then we've like put them out on the streets and then called them dirty, and they're not. They make really lovely pets, or can make really lovely pets, and yeah, I don't know. Be kind to pigeons. I don't know, because pigeons are God. Like, God came as a pigeon. Okay, all right, I'll stop.
Yeah. They're living their lives. You should respect it.
Exactly. It also reminded me of a story of I was in Denver for one of my mom's surgeries, and we were inside a lot of the day, and in hospital settings, it's easy to forget that you are still part of creation and part of nature, because fluorescent lighting, it smells antiseptic and etc. But we went outside to eat lunch, and there was these tiny little birds that would come around and get the crumbs. And I don't know, there was a bird just kind of hanging out with us, and it was just this great. Yeah, it kind of grounded me, got me back in touch with Earth, and broke me out of this kind of hospital bubble.
That's cool.
I can just see a lot of people listening to this and being like, fine, but how is this, like, sure, God came as a pigeon, but how is it, like, is this really biblical, or are we like trying to stretch this? But your book is like chock full of biblical references. So could you pick a couple and dig into how they show this animistic view of creation?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of Psalms that talk about it. There's Isaiah, there's even in the Gospels, as you mentioned, the rocks opening out or cracking when Jesus dies. So the first one that is really easy to see that comes to mind is Psalm 19. And this is just the first 4 verses. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. Yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. And so this is kind of talking about how the day speaks and the night speaks, and we should be listening. And it's sort of a riddle. So I think it's meant to say it's not in human language, it's in a different language, but it's something that we ought to pay attention to because it contains the wisdom of God. And then another similar example is from Psalm 98, and this is quoted a lot. This is verses 7 through 9. Let the sea roar and all that fills it, the world and those who live in it. Let the floods clap their hands. Let the hills sing together for joy at the presence of the Lord, for he is coming to judge the earth. And that's a really great. And like you said, there's this song about the trees clapping their hands, and we're like, oh, that's such a great metaphor. But it's not a metaphor. The hills proclaim the glory of God. And if you go out and stand on a hill, especially at sunrise or sunset, you can feel that, and you can hear that voice of praising God, and you can and feel the sacredness kind of suffuse throughout creation. And so there are lots of examples, but those are just a few.
Mm-hmm. That makes me think of the Mary Oliver poem, and it goes. There's a bit of it that goes something like, uh, "I don't," or is it? "I don't know how to pray, but I do know how to
Mhm.
pay attention." Isn't it something like
Yeah,
that?
yeah, yeah.
It's the summer day. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I've been doing all day. I like that. I like that poem a lot.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Um, a different psalm, if you know what I mean.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, thank you for all of that. Do you have any final advice for people trying to connect with creation, and maybe as an antidote to climate crisis, or as a way to soothe climate anxiety, connecting with creation, um, or any resources to share? And you can also email me resources, and I can put them in the description. I'll put down all the books you kind of mentioned, as well as your book,
Okay.
of course.
Yeah.
But yeah, any final thoughts?
I think the most important thing is just to go outside and pay attention to what you see. Doesn't matter if it's rainy or stormy or cold, just pay attention and try to do that every day. To go outside and listen to hear what the earth is saying to you. If you never do more than that, That's enough. You can get really into identifying birds and plants and things like that, but even if you don't know their names, to just listen to what they're saying to you. Randy Woodley has a new book called Becoming Rooted. It has, I think, 28 short chapters, so you can read one a day. And each day is kind of practical advice for reconnecting with the earth. And then another good book is Restoring the Kinship Worldview by Wahinkipe Topa and Darcia Narvaez. And it's similar. They're both indigenous scholars kind of giving people practical advice for thinking about your relationship with creation in a different way.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, go order Sarah's book, Really in the Sun Rooted Faith. And
it's on Amazon and Minnow Media. So.
And Minnow Media. I think I might have, I can't remember. I might have gotten this out of, oh no, you guys sent me this, never mind. And whenever we put out an episode that we promote a book, we always do a book giveaway, so people can watch out for that. Yeah, well, it's tradition to end the podcast with a blessing. So, Sarah, would it be okay if I bless you and all of our baddies out there? And do you have a dog that you could wrangle that I could bless your dog, or is your dog off doing something?
He's outside.
That's okay. Inside is outside anyways, so the blessing will go through. Okay. Sarah and all of you beautiful baddies out there. My blessing, my prayer, my wish for you is that you can go outside today, put your feet on the ground, and feel the earth and the divine holding you. May you learn how to pay attention. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for coming on. It feels very full circle and good to talk with you about this after our conversation. brief conversation at GBCO.
Yeah, this is great.
That's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.